The moment someone laughs at your value is often the moment you stop asking them to recognize it. My name is Lucas Bennett, and the night my wife accidentally set me free began like 100 other evenings before it. It was a cool October Saturday in Colorado. The air outside carried the sharp scent of fallen leaves, and a steady breeze moved through the trees beyond our backyard fence. Inside our house, everything looked perfect. Soft music played through hidden speakers. Candles flickered on the kitchen island. Friends gathered in the living room holding glasses of wine and laughing at stories that seemed far more entertaining than anything waiting for them at home. Olivia loved hosting nights like these. She had a natural ability to fill a room with energy. People gravitated toward her. They always had. I was finishing a few work emails in my home office before joining everyone. Earlier that week, my company had secured a major commercial renovation contract, and I wanted to review a few final details before Monday. By the time I closed my laptop, the house was already buzzing with conversation. I stood, stretched, and headed toward the kitchen for a bottle of water. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. Just another ordinary moment in a marriage that had long ago become routine. As I approached the hallway connecting my office to the main living area, I heard my wife laughing. Several of her friends were gathered near the fireplace. Their voices drifted through the house, blending with the music and the occasional sound of glasses touching together. Then I heard one of her friends ask a question. I could not make out every word, but I heard enough to understand the subject was me. I slowed my steps without meaning to. Olivia laughed again before answering. His presence irritates me. Honestly, I wish he would disappear forever. The room erupted in laughter. Not uncomfortable laughter. Not nervous laughter. Genuine laughter. The kind that follows a joke everyone finds amusing. I stopped walking. For a few seconds, I simply stood there in the hallway staring at the hardwood floor beneath my feet. The strange thing was that I did not feel shocked. Not completely. If anything, I felt something far more unsettling. Recognition. Because deep down, part of me already knew she felt that way. Those words did not create a new reality. They revealed one that had existed for years. The laughter continued. Someone made another comment. More laughter followed. Meanwhile, the refrigerator hummed quietly in the kitchen. The furnace kicked on somewhere in the house. Outside, a car drove past our neighborhood. The world kept moving exactly as it had 1 minute earlier. Yet something inside me had shifted permanently. I wish I could tell you I walked into the room and confronted everyone. I wish I could tell you I demanded an explanation. That would probably sound satisfying. The truth is much simpler. I quietly walked into the kitchen, grabbed my bottle of water, and returned to my office without anyone noticing I had been there. Sitting behind my desk, I stared through the window overlooking the backyard. The security lights illuminated patches of grass and drifting leaves. Everything looked peaceful, almost beautiful. For years, I had spent enormous amounts of energy trying to become someone Olivia would appreciate again. I worked harder, supported her career, solved problems before they reached her, handled responsibilities without complaint. Every time the distance between us grew larger, I convinced myself that more effort would eventually close the gap. But sitting there alone that night, I finally understood something I should have learned long ago. You cannot earn appreciation from someone who has stopped looking for your value. The realization hurt, but it also felt strangely liberating. For the first time in years, I stopped asking what I could do differently. Instead, I started asking a different question entirely. What would my life look like if I stopped fighting for a place where I was no longer wanted? Down the hallway, Olivia and her friends continued laughing together. She thought she had made a harmless joke. She thought it would disappear into the noise of the evening like every other casual comment. What she did not know was that her words had just accomplished something years of arguments, disappointments, and loneliness never could. They finally convinced me to let go. The next morning arrived with the same quiet certainty that had settled over me the night before. Colorado mornings in late October carried a particular stillness, especially before sunrise. The sky outside our kitchen windows was still dark when I poured a cup of coffee and sat alone at the dining table. The house was silent. Olivia was still asleep upstairs, completely unaware that something fundamental had changed. I stared out at the backyard where a thin layer of frost covered the grass and realized I felt different. Not happier, not angry, just awake. For years, I had been living on a kind of emotional autopilot. I woke up, worked hard, handled responsibilities, supported my wife, and convinced myself that if I kept showing up, things would eventually improve. That morning was the first time I questioned whether improvement had ever been possible. Looking back now, I do not think Olivia became dismissive overnight. Nobody wakes up one day and suddenly stops valuing someone they once loved. It happens gradually. Small moments accumulate. Attention fades. Appreciation becomes assumption. Then assumption becomes expectation. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being a person and became a function. I was the man who fixed things, paid bills, handled problems, and made life easier. Useful, but invisible. The strange part was that I helped create that reality myself. Every time I absorbed disappointment without addressing it, I taught people what I was willing to accept. Every time I ignored a careless comment, I quietly lowered the standard. Every time I chose peace over honesty, I allowed distance to grow. As the coffee cooled in my hands, memories surfaced one after another. A company awards banquet 3 years earlier where Olivia spent the entire evening introducing colleagues while barely acknowledging I was there. A vacation planning discussion where everyone else's preferences seemed important except mine. A birthday dinner that she completely forgot until late in the evening after seeing a social media reminder. None of those moments ended a marriage. Yet together they formed a pattern that became impossible to ignore once I finally stopped making excuses. Around 7 o'clock, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Olivia entered the kitchen wearing workout clothes and carrying her phone. She smiled briefly without looking away from the screen. "Morning," she said. "Morning," I replied. She poured herself coffee, checked a few messages, and began talking about an upcoming marketing presentation. I listened carefully, asking questions and offering encouragement. It was the same role I had played for years. The difference was that this time I noticed something. During the entire conversation, she never asked how I was doing. She never asked about the contract I had secured the previous week. She never asked what I had been working on late into the evening. The realization did not hurt the way it once would have. Instead, it felt like confirmation. Evidence supporting a conclusion I had already reached. A few minutes later, she grabbed her keys and headed toward the door. "I might be home late," she said. "Big meeting today." "Good luck," I replied. She smiled. "Thanks." Then she left. I listened to the garage door close and the sound of her car disappearing down the street. The silence that followed felt unusually peaceful. For the first time in a very long time, I stopped focusing on what Olivia thought of me and started thinking about what I thought of myself. The question was uncomfortable because I had ignored it for years. Somewhere between building a business and maintaining a marriage, I had allowed my identity to become dependent on being needed. But what happens when the people you support no longer see your value? What happens when your presence becomes something tolerated rather than appreciated? Sitting alone in that quiet kitchen, I realized the answer was simpler than I had imagined. You stop chasing validation and start rebuilding your self-respect. Outside, the sun finally began rising over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the frost-covered lawns. It was the beginning of an ordinary day. Yet deep down, I knew I had already taken the first step toward a life Olivia never saw coming. The hardest part about being taken for granted is that it rarely looks dramatic while it is happening. Most of the time, it looks ordinary. That was what I began noticing during the weeks after that October evening. Once I stopped trying to defend the marriage in my own mind, I started seeing things with a level of clarity that had been missing for years. The signs had always been there. I had simply refused to connect them. One afternoon, while driving between project sites, I found myself thinking about a company celebration from several years earlier. Olivia had recently received a major promotion, and her firm hosted a dinner at a downtown Denver hotel. The ballroom was filled with executives, clients, and colleagues. Throughout the evening, people congratulated her, praised her accomplishments, and asked about her future plans. I was genuinely proud of her. Watching her succeed had never threatened me. In many ways, I had helped make those opportunities possible by supporting her through years of demanding schedules and long workdays. At one point, a group gathered around our table, and someone asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Olivia smiled and said, "Lucas spends most of his time around construction sites. He probably knows more about concrete than people." Everyone laughed politely. I laughed too. At the time, I convinced myself it was harmless. Looking back, I realized something important. It was not the joke that mattered. It was how easily she dismissed me in front of others. Another memory surfaced a few days later. We had been discussing renovations for our own house. The kitchen needed updates, and I had spent weeks researching materials, pricing, and contractors. During a conversation with friends, Olivia presented nearly every idea as though she had developed the plan herself. My contributions disappeared from the story completely. Again, it was not a major event. Nobody was being cruel. Yet small moments like that accumulated over time. Piece by piece, they changed the way people saw me. More importantly, they changed the way I saw myself. One Saturday morning, I was cleaning out a storage cabinet in the garage when I found an old photo album. Dust covered the edges, and the pages had begun to yellow slightly with age. I carried it inside and sat at the kitchen table flipping through photographs from earlier years. There we were during a summer road trip through Utah. There we were celebrating our 10th wedding anniversary. There we were standing in front of our first home, smiling like two people who believed they could overcome anything together. For a moment, I felt a familiar sadness. Not because those memories were fake. They were real. That was what made everything so difficult. People often assume failing relationships are built entirely on misery. The truth is usually more complicated. Good memories can coexist with present disappointment. Love can exist alongside neglect. Looking at those photographs, I realized I was not mourning the marriage we had. I was mourning the marriage I thought we would continue building. Later that evening, Olivia returned from a networking event and began telling me about conversations she had with several colleagues. I listened, asked questions, and encouraged her exactly as I always had. When she finished speaking, silence settled between us. She glanced at her phone and started responding to messages. The moment passed. She never asked about my day, never asked what I had been working on, never asked why I seemed quieter than usual. Sitting across from her at the table, I experienced a realization that felt both painful and liberating. The loneliness I had been carrying was not caused by being alone. It was caused by feeling unseen while sitting beside someone who was supposed to know me best. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the backyard while the last light of day faded behind the trees. Inside, Olivia continued scrolling through her phone, completely unaware that every forgotten conversation, every dismissive comment, and every overlooked sacrifice was slowly becoming part of a larger picture. And for the first time, I stopped asking whether things would improve and started wondering what my future might look like if I finally chose myself. The moment you stop trying to save something is the moment you begin seeing it clearly. That realization stayed with me throughout November. While Olivia moved through her routine, believing everything remained unchanged, I quietly started building a future she could not see. There was nothing dramatic about it. No secret bank accounts hidden offshore. No elaborate schemes. Just practical decisions made one careful step at a time. One cold Tuesday morning, I drove into downtown Denver for a meeting with an attorney named Charles Whitman. His office occupied the upper floor of a modern glass building overlooking the city. Snow clouds hung low over the mountains in the distance, while traffic moved steadily below. Sitting across from him in a conference room, I answered questions about finances, property, and long-term plans. The conversation was calm and professional. At one point, Charles looked at me and asked a simple question. "Are you certain this is what you want?" I stared through the window for a few seconds before responding. "I am certain I cannot keep living the way I am living now." He nodded. There was no need to explain further. Some truths become obvious long before they are spoken aloud. Over the following weeks, I handled everything quietly. Financial records were organized. Important documents were reviewed. Personal items were sorted. The process felt strangely familiar. In construction, every successful project begins long before anyone notices visible progress. Foundations are prepared beneath the surface. Measurements are checked repeatedly. Plans are refined. The same principle applied to life. If I was going to leave, I wanted to do it responsibly. Meanwhile, Olivia remained completely unaware. Looking back, I do not think she was intentionally ignoring the signs. She simply had no reason to look for them. People rarely question routines that benefit them. One evening, she returned home excited about an upcoming presentation. We sat at the kitchen counter while she described new opportunities at work. I listened carefully, offering encouragement and asking questions. She smiled several times during the conversation. Anyone watching us would have assumed we were a perfectly functional couple. Yet beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. I was no longer investing emotionally in a future that depended on her finally seeing me. The decision had already been made. She just did not know it yet. A few days later, I visited an apartment complex on the western side of the city. The property overlooked a small park filled with evergreen trees and walking paths. The apartment itself was modest compared to the house Olivia and I shared. One bedroom, simple finishes, large windows facing the mountains. Nothing about it was impressive. Yet the moment I stepped inside, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Calm. Sunlight poured through the windows and stretched across the hardwood floors. Outside, a few people walked dogs along the trail while children played near a small pond. The space felt peaceful, honest. There were no expectations there. No need to constantly earn appreciation. No need to convince anyone of my worth. Just quiet. Standing in the empty living room, I found myself imagining a life that belonged entirely to me. Not a life built around fixing someone else's perception. A life built around self-respect. Later that evening, I returned home carrying a folder of paperwork. Olivia was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone while a television show played in the background. She glanced up briefly. "How was your day?" she asked. It was one of the first times she had asked that question in weeks. "Productive," I replied. She smiled absent-mindedly and returned her attention to the screen. The conversation ended there. As I walked upstairs, I realized something important. If she had truly wanted to understand my life, she would have asked a second question. She would have shown curiosity, concern, interest. Instead, the moment passed as quickly as it appeared. That night, I sat alone in my office reviewing the lease agreement for the apartment. Outside, the first snowfall of the season drifted quietly across the backyard. The world looked peaceful beneath the porch lights. As I signed the final page and placed the document back into its folder, I understood that every choice I was making was carrying me toward a future Olivia never imagined. And with every step forward, leaving no longer felt like a possibility. It was becoming a plan. The day I left arrived on a cold January morning so ordinary that nobody would have guessed it marked the end of a marriage. Snow covered the rooftops across the neighborhood, and the sky was painted in soft shades of gray as dawn slowly approached. Olivia woke up early for an important meeting and moved through the kitchen with her usual sense of urgency. She checked emails while drinking coffee, gathered a few files for work, and talked briefly about her schedule for the day. I listened carefully, nodding at the appropriate moments. On the surface, nothing felt unusual. We had shared thousands of mornings that looked exactly like this one. The difference was that this would be our last. Around 7 o'clock, she picked up her coat and purse and headed toward the garage. Before leaving, she glanced back and smiled. "I will probably be late tonight," she said. "The meeting might run longer than expected." "No problem," I replied. "Drive safely." She nodded and disappeared through the door. A few seconds later, I heard her car start and slowly back out of the driveway. Then the sound faded into the distance. Silence settled over the house. I stood in the kitchen for several moments staring at the closed garage door. Surprisingly, I felt calm. There was no panic. No second-guessing. The decision had already been made weeks earlier. Today was simply the day it became real. By 8 o'clock, the movers arrived. Most of the preparation had been completed gradually over the previous month. Important documents had been secured. Personal belongings had been sorted. Financial arrangements had been finalized. The apartment was ready. All that remained was transporting the final pieces of my life from one place to another. The process moved quickly. Furniture was loaded. Boxes disappeared room by room. Each empty space revealed how much emotional attachment I had already released. Years earlier, I might have viewed every object as a symbol of the life Olivia and I built together. Now they felt like artifacts from a chapter that had already ended. Around midday, I walked through the house alone one final time. Sunlight reflected off the snow outside and filled the rooms with a soft winter glow. Family photographs lined the hallway. Holiday decorations still occupied a few shelves. The dining table, where we had shared countless meals, stood quietly in place. Looking around, I felt gratitude more than sadness. There had been good years here. Real years. Meaningful years. The problem was not that those years never existed. The problem was that neither of us could live inside them forever. Eventually, reality catches up with memory. In the kitchen, I placed a sealed envelope on the counter. Inside were legal documents, contact information for Charles Whitman, and a short handwritten note. The note contained no accusations, no list of grievances, no attempt to make Olivia feel guilty. It simply explained that I wished her well and hoped she eventually found the happiness she had been searching for. Then I picked up my keys and walked toward the front door. Outside, the cold air felt sharp against my face. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I stepped onto the driveway. For a moment, I turned and looked back at the house. Not because I wanted to stay, because I wanted to remember the truth. Leaving was not an act of anger. It was an act of acceptance. I closed the door behind me and drove away. By late afternoon, I was sitting in my new apartment watching sunlight fade behind the Colorado mountains. The room was quiet except for the occasional sound of traffic in the distance. Then my phone vibrated. Olivia. I let it ring. A few minutes later, another call arrived. Then another. Soon text messages began appearing. Where are you? The next one arrived less than 5 minutes later. Lucas, what is going on? Then another. Please call me. I stared at the screen while darkness slowly settled outside my windows. For years, I had explained my feelings and hoped to be heard. Tonight, there was nothing left to explain. And as the messages continued arriving one after another, I realized something that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. For the first few weeks after I left, Olivia seemed more confused than heartbroken. At least that was the impression I got from the messages that continued appearing on my phone. Most of them were practical. She wanted to know where certain records were stored. She needed contact information for service providers. She had questions about insurance documents and maintenance schedules. None of the messages were cruel. None of them were emotional. They felt like requests from someone suddenly discovering how many invisible systems had been operating quietly in the background all along. Whenever a response was necessary, I answered politely and briefly. Then I returned to my own life. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. The peace I felt on that first evening did not disappear. It grew stronger. Every morning, I woke up before sunrise and sat near the apartment window with a cup of coffee while the city slowly came to life. The park below filled with joggers, dog walkers, and early commuters. Snow covered the paths for much of January, creating a calm, white landscape that felt completely different from the emotional noise I had left behind. For the first time in years, my mind felt clear. I no longer spent hours analyzing conversations or wondering whether I had done enough. I simply lived. Work began improving as well. Without the constant emotional exhaustion, my focus sharpened. Projects moved faster. Decisions became easier. Opportunities one might have overlooked before suddenly seemed obvious. In February, my company secured another major contract. Then another. Success was never the goal, but it became a natural byproduct of finally directing my energy toward things I could actually control. One afternoon, while reviewing plans with a client, I realized something surprising. I had gone nearly an entire day without thinking about my marriage. That realization stopped me cold. Not because it made me sad, because it showed me how much progress I had made. For years, my relationship had occupied the center of every decision. Now it was gradually becoming part of my past rather than the foundation of my future. Around the same time, Olivia's messages began changing. The practical questions became less frequent. New messages appeared instead. Short observations. Small comments. One evening she wrote, "The house feels strange." Another time she sent, "I never realized how quiet it gets here." I did not know how to respond to those messages, so most of the time I did not. Not because I lacked compassion. Because some lessons cannot be taught through conversation. People have to experience them for themselves. Weeks passed. Winter slowly gave way to early spring. Snow melted from the sidewalks. The days grew longer. One Saturday afternoon, I was assembling a bookshelf in the apartment when my phone rang again. "Olivia." I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, a message arrived. "The water heater stopped working. Do you remember who installed it?" I stared at the screen for a moment before sending the contractor's contact information. Then I sat quietly and thought about what the message represented. It was not really about a water heater. It was about awareness. For years, problems had appeared and disappeared before they ever reached her. Repairs happened. Appointments were scheduled. Details were managed. Life functioned smoothly because someone was paying attention. Now she was beginning to see the work that had always existed beneath the surface. By March, mutual acquaintances occasionally mentioned Olivia in conversation. Nobody shared anything dramatic. They simply described someone who seemed more reflective than before. She attended fewer social events, spent more time at home, became quieter. Listening to those observations, I felt neither satisfaction nor resentment, only understanding. Sometimes people do not recognize value until absence creates a comparison. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains outside my apartment window, I realized something important. Olivia was beginning to understand what she had lost. At the same time, I was beginning to understand what I had found. By the time autumn returned to Colorado, nearly a year had passed since I left the house. The seasons had completed a full circle, and in many ways, so had I. The man who walked away that January morning had been exhausted, uncertain, and carrying years of disappointment. The man sitting in his apartment overlooking the park now felt different. Stronger, calmer, more complete. My business continued growing steadily. Several commercial projects that began during the spring were now approaching completion, and for the first time in years, I found myself genuinely excited about the future. Not because everything was perfect, but because my happiness no longer depended on whether someone else noticed my effort. One afternoon, I met a longtime client for lunch in downtown Denver. We discussed construction timelines, budgets, and upcoming opportunities. Near the end of the meeting, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You seem different these days," he said. "In a good way." I laughed softly. "I hope that is true." "It is," he replied. "You look lighter." His comment stayed with me during the drive home. Lighter. That was exactly the word. For years, I had carried responsibilities that were not really mine. The responsibility to keep everyone happy. The responsibility to maintain a relationship by myself. The responsibility to earn appreciation that should have existed naturally. Once I stopped carrying those things, life became surprisingly manageable. Around that same time, mutual friends occasionally mentioned Olivia. Nobody intended to deliver updates. The information simply surfaced in conversation. I learned that she had become much more reserved. She rarely hosted gatherings anymore. She spent less time socializing and more time at home. One friend mentioned that she seemed reflective. Another described her as quieter than before. Hearing those observations, I felt no satisfaction. If anything, I felt sympathy. Growth often begins when comfort disappears. Unfortunately, growth rarely feels pleasant while it is happening. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected email from Rebecca Turner. She had been one of Olivia's closest friends for years and had attended many of the gatherings at our house. Her message was short but sincere. She apologized for moments when she witnessed dismissive comments and never challenged them. She admitted that many people assumed I would always be there because I always had been. Reading her words, I realized something important. Olivia was not the only person who had taken my presence for granted. The difference was that she was the one living with the consequences. One cool October evening, I attended a business networking event at a luxury hotel in downtown Denver. The ballroom was filled with investors, executives, and local business leaders. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the room, while the city skyline glowed through enormous windows overlooking Denver. Conversations flowed easily. Laughter echoed across the room. At one point, I was discussing a new development project with several colleagues when I felt a familiar sensation. Someone was looking at me. I glanced across the ballroom and saw Olivia standing near a group of coworkers. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Neither of us looked away immediately. The distance between us was only 30 feet, yet it felt like an entirely different lifetime separated us. She looked healthy, professional, composed, yet there was something different in her expression. A quiet sadness, a deeper awareness. For the first time, I saw someone who understood exactly what had been lost. Several months earlier, seeing her might have reopened old emotions. Instead, I felt calm. Not because I had stopped caring about our shared history, because I had finally accepted it. A few seconds later, someone asked me a question, and the moment passed. When I looked back across the room, Olivia was still there, watching, thinking, remembering, and standing beneath those bright ballroom lights, surrounded by people and opportunity and noise, I realized she was finally seeing something that had been right in front of her all along. The value of a person is easiest to ignore when you believe they will never leave. 2 weeks after the networking event, I received a message that somehow felt inevitable. It arrived on a quiet Thursday evening while I sat at my dining table reviewing project estimates. Outside, rain tapped softly against the apartment windows, turning the city lights into blurred reflections across the glass. My phone vibrated once. Then again. When I picked it up, I saw Olivia's name. For several seconds, I simply looked at the screen. The message contained only 4 words. Can we talk? A year earlier, those words would have sent my thoughts racing in a dozen different directions. Now they simply made me pause. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to ignore her, because I had finally reached a place where my peace no longer depended on what happened next. I set the phone down and returned to my work. Nearly an hour passed before I responded. What would you like to talk about? Her reply appeared almost immediately. Please, just one conversation. There was something different about the tone. No defensiveness, no frustration, no attempt to control the situation. Just sincerity. After thinking about it for a day, I agreed to meet her the following Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop near downtown Denver. As the weekend approached, I found myself surprisingly calm. I was not nervous. I was not hopeful. I was simply curious. Saturday arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. The mountains stood sharply against the horizon while golden leaves drifted through the streets. I arrived a few minutes early and chose a table near the window. Sunlight streamed across the wooden floor, and the quiet hum of conversation filled the room. A few minutes later, Olivia walked through the front door. For a moment, I barely recognized her. Not because she looked dramatically different, because her energy had changed. The confidence that once seemed effortless now felt quieter, more thoughtful, more grounded. She spotted me and slowly approached the table. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "Of course," I replied. She sat down, wrapped both hands around a coffee cup, and looked out the window for a moment before speaking again. "I have rehearsed this conversation 100 times. I listen without interrupting, and every version starts the same way." She took a slow breath. "I am sorry, Lucas." The words hung between us. Not dramatic, not emotional, just honest. "For a long time, I blamed everything except myself," she continued. "It was easier than admitting I was wrong." I remained silent. She deserved the opportunity to say what she came to say. "After you left, I kept telling myself I was adjusting to change," she said. "But that was not really what was happening." Her eyes met mine. I was realizing how much of my life I never appreciated. She looked down briefly before continuing. "Not just the things you handled. Not just the responsibilities. You." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the coffee shop faded into the background. "The house felt different," she said quietly. "Every room felt different. Every routine felt different. I kept waiting for things to feel normal again." A faint, sad smile crossed her face. They never did. I could hear the sincerity in her voice. That was what made the conversation difficult. Not because I doubted her, because I believed her completely. "I took you for granted," she said, "and I did not understand it until you were gone." There it was. The truth. Simple and undeniable. I nodded slowly. "I know." She looked surprised by the answer. Perhaps she expected anger. Perhaps she expected bitterness. Instead, all I felt was acceptance. Olivia stared out the window again before speaking. "I miss you, Lucas." The words were genuine. There was no manipulation behind them. No hidden strategy. Just regret. Real regret. And sitting across from her, I realized something important. Hearing those words would have meant everything to the man I used to be. The man who spent years trying to earn appreciation. The man who believed love alone could solve distance. The man who stayed long after he should have acknowledged the truth. But that version of me no longer existed. The silence that followed felt calm rather than uncomfortable. And for the first time since we sat down, I understood that Olivia had finally found the clarity I discovered a year earlier. The difference was that my journey had led me forward, while hers had led her back to something she could no longer reclaim. For several moments after Olivia spoke, neither of us said anything. The coffee shop remained filled with the quiet sounds of ordinary life. Cups touched tables. Conversations drifted through the room. Sunlight filtered through the windows and painted long shadows across the floor. It felt strange that something which had occupied so much of our lives could end in such a peaceful place. Olivia looked at me carefully. There was no anger in her eyes. No defensiveness. Just honesty. "I know I cannot change what happened," she said softly. "But if I could go back, I would do so many things differently." I believed her. That was what made the moment so complicated. Regret is easy to dismiss when it feels insincere. Real regret carries a different weight. It comes with understanding. It comes with accountability. Most importantly, it comes too late. I took a slow breath and looked out the window before answering. I believe you. Olivia lowered her eyes and nodded. A small expression of relief crossed her face. Not because she expected forgiveness to solve everything. Because she knew she had finally been heard. Thank you, she whispered. For a moment, I thought about the countless conversations I once imagined us having. The explanations. The apologies. The recognition I spent years hoping would arrive. Sitting there now, I realized something surprising. Closure rarely looks the way people expect. It is not a dramatic speech. It is not a perfect ending. Sometimes closure is simply accepting reality without trying to rewrite it. Olivia looked back at me. Do you ever think about us? She asked. The question deserved an honest answer. Sometimes, I said. I think about the good years. I think about the memories. I think about the life we built together. A faint smile appeared on her face. Then she waited. And then, she asked. I smiled gently. And then I remember that memories belong to the past. A future needs something more. The smile slowly faded, replaced by understanding. She nodded because she already knew what I meant. For years, I had tried to build a future for two people while only one person was carrying the weight. Eventually, even the strongest foundation begins to crack when only one side is supporting it. We sat quietly for a while longer. There was nothing left to argue about. Nothing left to defend. The truth had already done its work. Eventually, Olivia looked at me one final time. I really am sorry, Lucas. I know, I replied. And I appreciate that. She nodded slowly. Then she smiled, a little sadly. You seem happy. I thought about the question hidden inside those words. I am, I said. Not because everything worked out the way I expected. Because I finally learned that peace matters more than being understood. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then we both stood. The conversation had reached its natural ending. There was no dramatic farewell. No final attempt to change the outcome. Just two people acknowledging a truth that had taken years to fully understand. Take care of yourself, she said. You too, I replied. Then she walked toward the door. I watched her step outside into the afternoon sunlight before disappearing into the flow of the city. A few minutes later, I left as well. The air was cool. The sky was clear. In the distance, the Colorado mountains stood beneath the fading light of the day. As I walked toward my car, I felt grateful. Not for the pain, not for the mistakes, but for the lessons. Because sometimes losing the life you thought you wanted is the only way to discover the life you actually need. A few months later, the divorce was finalized. Life continued moving forward. My business continued growing. New opportunities appeared. New friendships formed. The future no longer felt like something to fear. It felt like something to welcome. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest victory was never proving my value to someone else. The greatest victory was finally recognizing it myself. And in the end, the irony was impossible to ignore. The thing Olivia once wished for eventually happened. I disappeared from her life. The tragedy was not that I left. The tragedy was that she only understood my worth after I was already gone. Before this story ends, I would genuinely love to know what you think. If you were in Lucas's position, would you have made the same choice, or would you have given the relationship another chance? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments, because every perspective tells a different story. And if stories about resilience, self-respect, growth, and finding peace after difficult chapters resonate with you, consider subscribing and joining us for more journeys like this. Sometimes the most powerful ending is not getting even. Sometimes it is simply moving forward with your dignity intact.